War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 15, read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. When returning from his leave, Rostov felt for the first time how close was the bond that united him to Denisov and the whole regiment. On approaching it, Rostov felt as he had done when approaching his home in Moscow. When he saw the first hussar with the unbuttoned uniform of his regiment, when he recognized red-haired Dementyev and saw the picket ropes of the roan horses, when Lavrushka gleefully shouted to his master, "The Count has come!" and Denisov, who had been asleep on his bed, ran all disheveled out of the mud hut to embrace him, and the officers collected round to greet the new arrival, Rostov experienced the same feeling his mother, his father, and his sister had embraced him, and tears of joy choked him so that he could not speak. The regiment was also a home, and as unalterably dear and precious as his parents' house. When he had reported himself to the commander of the regiment, and had been reassigned to his former squadron, had been on duty and had gone out foraging, when he had again entered into all the little interests of the regiment and felt himself deprived of liberty and bound in one narrow, unchanging frame, he experienced the same sense of peace, of moral support, and the same sense being at home here in his own place, as he had felt under the parental roof. But here was none of all that turmoil of the world at large, where he did not know his right place and took mistaken decisions. Here was no Sónya, with whom he ought or ought not to have an explanation. Here was no possibility of going there or not going there. Here there were not 24 hours in the day which could be spent in such a variety of ways. There was not that innumerable crowd of people of whom not one was nearer to him or farther from him than another. There were none of those uncertain and undefined money relations with his father, and nothing to recall that terrible loss to Dólokhov. Here, in the regiment, all was clear and simple. The whole world was divided into two unequal parts. One, our Pávlograd regiment; the other, all the rest. And the rest was no concern of his. In the regiment everything was definite: who was lieutenant, who captain, who was a good fellow, who a bad one, and most of all, who was a comrade. The canteen keeper gave one credit. One's pay came every 4 months. There was nothing to think out or decide. You had only to do nothing that was considered bad in the Pávlograd regiment, and, when given an order, to do what was clearly, distinctly, and definitely ordered, and all would be well. Having once more entered into the definite conditions of this regimental life, Rostov felt the joy and relief a tired man feels on lying down to rest. Life in the regiment, during this campaign, was all the pleasanter for him, because after his loss to Dólokhov, for which, in spite of all his family's efforts to console him, he could not forgive himself, he had made up his mind to atone for his fault by serving, not as he had done before, but really well, and by being a perfectly first-rate comrade and officer, in a word, a splendid man altogether, a thing which seemed so difficult out in the world, but so possible in the regiment. After his losses, he had determined to pay back his debt to his parents in 5 years. He received 10,000 rubles a year, but now resolved to take only 2,000 and leave the rest to repay the debt to his parents. Our army, after repeated retreats and advances, and battles at Pultusk and Preussisch Eylau, was concentrated near Bartenstein. It was awaiting the Emperor's arrival and the beginning of a new campaign. The Pávlograd regiment, belonging to that part of the army which had served in the 1805 campaign, had been recruiting up to strength in Russia, and arrived too late to take part in the first actions of the campaign. It had been neither at Pultusk nor at Preussisch Eylau, and, when it joined the army in the field in the second half of the campaign, was attached to Plátov's division. Plátov's division was acting independently of the main army. Several times parts of the Pávlograd regiment had exchanged shots with the enemy, had taken prisoners, and once had even captured Marshal Oudinot's carriages. In April, the Pavlograds were stationed immovably for some weeks near a totally ruined and deserted German village. A thaw had set in. It was muddy and cold. The ice on the river broke, and the roads became impassable. For days neither provisions for the men nor fodder for the horses had been issued. As no transports could arrive, the men dispersed about the abandoned and deserted villages searching for potatoes, but found few even of these. Everything had been eaten up, and the inhabitants had all fled, if any remained. They were worse than beggars, and nothing more could be taken from them. Even the soldiers, usually pitiless enough, instead of taking anything from them, often gave them the last of their rations. The Pavlograd regiment had had only 2 men wounded in action, but had lost nearly half its men from hunger and sickness. In the hospitals, death was so certain that soldiers suffering from fever or the swelling that came from bad food preferred to remain on duty, and hardly able to drag their legs, went to the front rather than to the hospitals. When spring came on, the soldiers found a plant just showing out of the ground that looked like asparagus, which, for some reason, they called Mashka's sweet root. It was very bitter, but they wandered about the field seeking it and dug it out with their sabers and ate it, though they were ordered not to do so, as it was a noxious plant. That spring a new disease broke out among the soldiers, a swelling of the arms, legs, and face, which the doctors attributed to eating this root. But in spite of all this, the soldiers of Denisov's squadron fed chiefly on Mashka's sweet root, because it was the second week that the last of the biscuits were being doled out at the rate of half a pound a man, and the last potatoes received had sprouted and frozen. The horses also had been fed for a fortnight on straw from the thatched roofs and had become terribly thin, though still covered with tufts of felty winter hair. Despite this destitution, the soldiers and officers went on living just as usual. Despite their pale, swollen faces and tattered uniforms, the hussars formed line for roll call, kept things in order, groomed their horses, polished their arms, brought in straw from thatched roofs in place of fodder, and sat down to dine round the cauldrons from which they rose up hungry, joking about their nasty food and their hunger. As usual, in their spare time, they lit bonfires, steamed themselves before them naked, smoked, picked out and baked sprouting rotten potatoes, told and listened to stories of Potemkin's and Suvorov's campaigns, or to legends of Elisha the Sly, or the priest's laborer Mikolka. The officers, as usual, lived in 2s and 3s in the roofless, half-ruined houses. The seniors tried to collect straw and potatoes, and in general food for the men. The younger ones occupied themselves as before, some playing cards, there was plenty of money though there was no food, some with more innocent games, such as quoits and skittles. The general trend of the campaign was rarely spoken of, partly because nothing certain was known about it, partly because there was a vague feeling that in the main it was going badly. Rostov lived, as before, with Denisov, and since their furlough they had become more friendly than ever. Denisov never spoke of Rostov's family, but by the tender friendship his commander showed him, Rostov felt that the elder hussar's luckless love for Natásha played a part in strengthening their friendship. Denisov evidently tried to expose Rostov to danger as seldom as possible, and after an action greeted his safe return with evident joy. On one of his foraging expeditions in a deserted and ruined village to which he had come in search of provisions, Rostov found a family consisting of an old Pole and his daughter, with an infant in arms. They were half-clad, hungry, too weak to get away on foot, and had no means of obtaining a conveyance. Rostov brought them to his quarters, placed them in his own lodging, and kept them for some weeks while the old man was recovering. One of his comrades, talking of women, began chaffing Rostov, saying that he was more wily than any of them, and that it would not be a bad thing if he introduced to them the pretty Polish girl he had saved. Rostov took the joke as an insult, flared up, and said such unpleasant things to the officer that it was all Denisov could do to prevent a duel. When the officer had gone away, Denisov, who did not himself know what Rostov's relations with the Polish girl might be, began to upbraid him for his quickness of temper, and Rostov replied, "Say what you like. She is like a sister to me, and I can't tell you how it offended me, because... well, for that reason..." Denisov patted him on the shoulder and began rapidly pacing the room without looking at Rostov, as was his way at moments of deep feeling. "Ah, what a mad breed you Rostovs are," he muttered, and Rostov noticed tears in his eyes. End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Moline. War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 16. Read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. In April, the troops were enlivened by news of the Emperor's arrival, but Rostov had no chance of being present at the review he held at Bartenstein, as the Pávlograds were at the outposts far beyond that place. They were bivouacking. Denisov and Rostov were living in an earth hut, dug out for them by the soldiers and roofed with branches and turf. The hut was made in the following manner, which had then come into vogue. A trench was dug 3½ feet wide, 4 feet 8 inches deep, and 8 feet long. At one end of the trench, steps were cut out, and these formed the entrance and vestibule. The trench itself was the room in which the lucky ones, such as the squadron commander, had a board lying on piles at the end opposite the entrance to serve as a table. On each side of the trench the earth was cut out to a breadth of about 2½ feet, and this did duty for bedsteads and couches. The roof was so constructed that one could stand up in the middle of the trench, and could even sit up on the beds if one drew close to the table. Denisov, who was living luxuriously because the soldiers of his squadron liked him, had also a board in the roof at the farther end, with a piece of broken but mended glass in it for a window. When it was very cold, embers from the soldiers' campfire were placed on a bent sheet of iron on the steps in the reception room, as Denisov called that part of the hut, and it was then so warm that the officers, of whom there were always some with Denisov and Rostov, sat in their shirt sleeves. In April, Rostov was on orderly duty. One morning, between 7 and 8, returning after a sleepless night, he sent for embers, changed his rain-soaked underclothes, said his prayers, drank tea, got warm, then tidied up the things on the table and in his own corner, and, his face glowing from exposure to the wind and with nothing on but his shirt, lay down on his back, putting his arms under his head. He was pleasantly considering the probability of being promoted in a few days for his last reconnoitering expedition, and was awaiting Denisov, who had gone out somewhere and with whom he wanted to talk. Suddenly he heard Denisov shouting in a vibrating voice behind the hut, evidently much excited. Rostov moved to the window to see whom he was speaking to, and saw the quartermaster, Topchenko. "I ordered you not to let them eat that Moscow wood stuff," Denisov was shouting, "and I saw with my own eyes how Lazarchuk brought some from the fields." "I have given the order again and again, your honor, but they don't obey," answered the quartermaster. Rostov lay down again on his bed and thought complacently, "Let him fuss and bustle now, my job's done and I'm lying down capitally." He could hear that Lavrushka, that sly, bold orderly of Denisov's, was talking, as well as the quartermaster. Lavrushka was saying something about loaded wagons, biscuits, and oxen he had seen when he had gone out for provisions. Then Denisov's voice was heard shouting farther and farther away, "Saddle! Second platoon!" Where are they off to now? Thought Rostov. 5 minutes later, Denisov came into the hut, climbed with muddy boots on the bed, lit his pipe, furiously scattered his things about, took his leaded whip, buckled on his saber, and went out again. In answer to Rostov's inquiry where he was going, he answered vaguely and crossly that he had some business. "Let God and our great monarch judge me afterwards," said Denisov, going out, and Rostov heard the hoofs of several horses splashing through the mud. He did not even trouble to find out where Denisov had gone. Having got warm in his corner, he fell asleep and did not leave the hut till toward evening. Denisov had not yet returned. The weather had cleared up, and near the next hut 2 officers and a cadet were playing sveka, laughing as they threw their missiles which buried themselves in the soft mud. Rostov joined them. In the middle of the game the officers saw some wagons approaching with 15 hussars and their skinny horses behind them. The wagons, escorted by the hussars, drew up to the picket ropes, and a crowd of hussars surrounded them. "There now, Denisov has been worrying," said Rostov, "and here are the provisions." "So they are," said the officers. "Won't the soldiers be glad!" A little behind the hussars came Denisov, accompanied by 2 infantry officers with whom he was talking. Rostov went to meet them. "I warn you, Captain," one of the officers, a short thin man, evidently very angry, was saying. "Haven't I told you I won't give them up?" replied Denisov. "You will answer for it, Captain. It is mutiny, seizing the transport of one's own army. Our men have had nothing to eat for 2 days." "And mine have had nothing for 2 weeks," said Denisov. "It is robbery. You'll answer for it, sir," said the infantry officer, raising his voice. "Now, what are you pestering me for?" cried Denisov, suddenly losing his temper. "I shall answer for it and not you, and you'd better not buzz about here till you get hurt. Be off! Go!" he shouted at the officers. "Very well then," shouted the little officer, undaunted and not riding away. "If you are determined to rob, I'll go to the devil, quick mach, while you're safe and sound," and Denisov turned his horse on the officer. Very well, muttered the officer threateningly, and turning his horse he trotted away, jolting in his saddle. "A dog astride a fence, a wheel dog astride a fence," shouted Denisov after him, the most insulting expression a cavalryman can address to a mounted infantryman, and riding up to Rostov he burst out laughing. "I've taken transports from the infantry by force," he said. "After all, can't let our men starve." The wagons that had reached the hussars had been consigned to an infantry regiment, but learning from Lavrúshka that the transport was unescorted, Denisov and his hussars had seized it by force. The soldiers had biscuits dealt out to them freely, and they even shared them with the other squadrons. The next day the regimental commander sent for Denisov, and holding his fingers spread out before his eyes, said, "This is how I look at this affair. I know nothing about it and won't begin proceedings, but I advise you to ride over to the staff and settle the business there in the commissariat department, and if possible, sign a receipt for such and such stores received. If not, as the demand was booked against an infantry regiment, there will be a row and the affair may end badly." From the regimental commanders, Denisov rode straight to the staff with a sincere desire to act on this advice. In the evening he came back to his dugout in a state such as Rostov had never yet seen him in. Denisov could not speak and gasped for breath. When Rostov asked what was the matter, he only uttered some incoherent oaths and threats in a hoarse, feeble voice. Alarmed at Denisov's condition, Rostov suggested that he should undress, drink some water, and send for the doctor. "Twy me for robbery! Oh! Some more water. Let them twy me. I'll always thrash scoundrels. And I'll tell the Emperor he muttered. The regimental doctor, when he came, said it was absolutely necessary to bleed Denisov. A deep saucer of black blood was taken from his hairy arm, and only then was he able to relate what had happened to him. "I get there. began Denisov. "Now then, where's your chief's quarters?" They were pointed out. "Please to wait." "I've ridden 20 miles and have duties to attend to, and no time to wait." "Announce me." Very well, so out comes their head chief. Also took it into his head to lecture me. "It's wobbery." "Wobbery, I say, is not done by a man who seizes provisions to feed his soldiers, but by him who takes them to fill his own pockets. Will you please be silent? Very good. Then he says, 'Go and give a receipt to the commissioner, but your affair will be passed on to headquarters.' I go to the commissioner, I enter, and at the table, who do you think? No, but wait a bit. Who is it that's starving us?" shouted Denisov, hitting the table with the fist of his newly bled arm so violently that the table nearly broke down and the tumblers on it jumped about. "Telyanin. What? So it's you who's starving us to death, is it? Take this and this," and I hit him so pat, straight on his snout. Ah, what a, and I started flashing him. Well, I've had a bit of fun, I can tell you, cried Denisov, gleeful and yet angry, his white teeth showing under his black mustache. I'd have killed him if they hadn't taken him away. "But what are you shouting for? Calm yourself," said Rostov. "You've set your arm bleeding afresh. Wait, we must tie it up again." Denisov was bandaged up again and put to bed. Next day he woke calm and cheerful. But at noon the adjutant of the regiment came into Rostov's and Denisov's dugout with a grave and serious face, and regretfully showed them a paper addressed to Major Denisov from the regimental commander in which inquiries were made about yesterday's occurrence. The adjutant told them that the affair was likely to take a very bad turn, that a court-martial had been appointed, and that in view of the severity with which marauding and insubordination were now regarded, degradation to the ranks would be the best that could be hoped for. The case, as represented by the offended parties, was that after seizing the transports, Major Denisov, being drunk, went to the chief quartermaster and without any provocation called him a thief, threatened to strike him, and on being led out had rushed into the office and given 2 officials a thrashing and dislocated the arm of one of them. In answer to Rostov's renewed questions, Denisov said, laughing, that he thought he remembered that some other fellows had got mixed up in it, but that it was all nonsense and rubbish, and he did not in the least fear any kind of trial, and that if those scoundrels dared attack him, he would give them an answer that they would not easily forget. Denisov spoke contemptuously of the whole matter, but Rostov knew him too well not to detect that, while hiding it from others, at heart he feared a court-martial and was worried over the affair, which was evidently taking a bad turn. Every day letters of inquiry and notices from the court arrived, and on the 1st of May Denisov was ordered to hand the squadron over to the next in seniority and appear before the staff of his division to explain his violence at the commissariat office. On the previous day Platov reconnoitered with 2 Cossack regiments and 2 squadrons of hussars. Denisov, as was his wont, rode out in front of the outposts, parading his courage. A bullet fired by a French sharpshooter hit him in the fleshy part of his leg. Perhaps at another time Denisov would not have left the regiment for so slight a wound, but now he took advantage of it to excuse himself from appearing at the staff and went into hospital. End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Moline. War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 17. Read for LibriVox.org by Roger Moline. In June, the Battle of Friedland was fought, in which the Pávlograds did not take part, and after that an armistice was proclaimed. Rostov, who felt his friend's absence very much, having no news of him since he left and feeling very anxious about his wound and the progress of his affairs, took advantage of the armistice to get leave to visit Denisov in hospital. The hospital was in a small Prussian town that had been twice devastated by Russian and French troops. Because it was summer, when it is so beautiful out in the fields, the little town presented a particularly dismal appearance with its broken roofs and fences, its foul streets, tattered inhabitants, and the sick and drunken soldiers wandering about. The hospital was in a brick building with some of the window frames and panes broken and a courtyard surrounded by the remains of a wooden fence that had been pulled to pieces. Several bandaged soldiers with pale, swollen faces were sitting or walking about in the sunshine in the yard. Directly Rostov entered the door he was enveloped by a smell of putrefaction and hospital air. On the stairs he met a Russian army doctor smoking a cigar. The doctor was followed by a Russian assistant. "I can't tear myself to pieces," the doctor was saying. "Come to Makar Alexéevich in the evening. I shall be there." The assistant asked some further questions. "Oh, do the best you can. Isn't it all the same?" The doctor noticed Rostov coming upstairs. "What do you want, sir?" said the doctor. "What do you want? The bullets having spared you, do you want to try typhus? This is a pest house, sir." "How so?" asked Rostov. "Typhus, sir. It's death to go in. Only we two, Makeyev and I," he pointed to the assistant, "keep on here. Some 5 of us doctors have died in this place. When a new one comes, he is done for in a week," said the doctor with evident satisfaction. "Prussian doctors have been invited here, but our allies don't like it at all." Rostov explained that he wanted to see Major Denisov of the Hussars, who was wounded. "I don't know. I can't tell you, sir. Only think, I am alone in charge of 3 hospitals with more than 400 patients. It's well that the charitable Prussian ladies send us 2 pounds of coffee and some lint each month, or we should be lost." He laughed. 400, sir, and they're always sending me fresh ones. There are 400, eh?" he asked, turning to the assistant. The assistant looked fagged out. He was evidently vexed and impatient for the talkative doctor to go. "Major Denisov," Rostov said again. "He was wounded at Molotin." "Dead, I fancy, eh, Makeyev?" queried the doctor in a tone of indifference. The assistant, however, did not confirm the doctor's words. "Is he tall and with reddish hair?" asked the doctor. Rostov described Denisov's appearance. "There was one like that," said the doctor, as if pleased. "That one is dead, I fancy. However, I'll look up our list. We had a list. Have you got it, Makeyev?" "Makar Alexéevich has the list," answered the assistant. "But if you'll step into the officers' wards, you'll see for yourself," he added, turning to Rostov. "Ah, you better not go, sir," said the doctor, "or you may have to stay here yourself." But Rostov bowed himself away from the doctor and asked the assistant to show him the way. "Only don't blame me," the doctor shouted up after him. Rostov and the assistant went into the dark corridor. The smell was so strong here that Rostov held his nose and had to pause and collect his strength before he could go on. A door opened to the right, and an emaciated sallow man on crutches, barefoot and in underclothing, limped out and, leaning against the doorpost, looked with glittering envious eyes at those who were passing. Glancing in at the door, Rostov saw that the sick and wounded were lying on the floor on straw and overcoats. "May I go in and look?" "What is there to see?" said the assistant. But, just because the assistant evidently did not want him to go in, Rostov entered the soldiers' ward. The foul air, to which he had already begun to get used in the corridor, was still stronger here. It was a little different, more pungent, and one felt that this was where it originated. In the long room, brightly lit up by the sun through the large windows, the sick and wounded lay in 2 rows with their heads to the walls and leaving a passage in the middle. Most of them were unconscious and paid no attention to the newcomers. Those who were conscious raised themselves or lifted their thin yellow faces, and all looked intently at Rostov with the same expression of hope, of relief, reproach, and envy of another's health. Rostov went to the middle of the room, and looking through the open doors into the 2 adjoining rooms saw the same thing there. He stood still, looking silently around. He had not at all expected such a sight. Just before him, almost across the middle of the passage on the bare floor, lay a sick man, probably a Cossack to judge by the cut of his hair. The man lay on his back, his huge arms and legs outstretched. His face was purple, his eyes were rolled back so that only the whites were seen, and on his bare legs and arms, which were still red, the veins stood out like cords. He was knocking the back of his head against the floor, hoarsely uttering some word which he kept repeating. Rostov listened and made out the word. It was "Drink, drink, a drink." Rostov glanced round, looking for someone who would put this man back in his place and bring him water. "Who looks after the sick here?" he asked the assistant. Just then a commissariat soldier, a hospital orderly, came in from the next room, marching stiffly, and drew up in front of Rostov. "Good day, your honor!" he shouted, rolling his eyes at Rostov and evidently mistaking him for one of the hospital authorities. "Get him to his place and give him some water," said Rostov, pointing to the Cossack. "Yes, your honor," the soldier replied complacently, and rolling his eyes more than ever he drew himself up still straighter, but did not move. "No, it's impossible to do anything here," thought Rostov, lowering his eyes, and he was going out, but became aware of an intense look fixed on him on his right, and he turned. Close to the corner, on an overcoat, sat an old, unshaven, gray-bearded soldier as thin as a skeleton, with a stern, sallow face and eyes intently fixed on Rostov. The man's neighbor on one side whispered something to him, pointing at Rostov, who noticed that the old man wanted to speak to him. He drew nearer and saw that the old man had only one leg bent under him, the other had been amputated above the knee. His neighbor on the other side, who lay motionless some distance from him, with his head thrown back, was a young soldier with a snub nose. His pale, waxen face was still freckled and his eyes were rolled back. Rostov looked at the young soldier, and a cold chill ran down his back. "Why, this one seems..." he began, turning to the assistant. "And how we've been begging, your honor," said the old soldier, his jaw quivering. "He's been dead since morning. After all, we're men, not dogs." "I'll send someone at once. He shall be taken away at once," said the assistant hurriedly. "Let us go, your honor." "Yes, yes, let us go," said Rostov hastily, and lowering his eyes and shrinking, he tried to pass unnoticed between the rows of reproachful, envious eyes that were fixed upon him, and went out of the room. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Moline.
Peace, Book 5, Chapter 18. Read for LibriVox.org by Gemma Blythe. Going along the corridor, the assistant led Rostov to the officers' wards, consisting of 3 rooms, the doors of which stood open. There were beds in these rooms, and the sick and wounded officers were lying or sitting on them. Some were walking about the rooms in hospital dressing gowns. The first person Rostov met in the officers' ward was a thin little man with one arm, who was walking about the first room in a nightcap and hospital dressing-gown, with a pipe between his teeth. Rostov looked at him, trying to remember where he had seen him before. "See where we've met again," said the little man. "Túshin, don't you remember who gave you a lift at Schöngrabern? And I've had a bit cut off, you see," he went on with a smile, pointing to the empty sleeve of his dressing-gown. "Looking for Vasíli Dmítrich Denisov? My neighbor," he added, when he heard who Rostov wanted. Here," and Túshin led him into the next room, from whence came sounds of several laughing voices. How can they laugh, or even live at all here, thought Rostov, still aware of that smell of decomposing flesh that had been so strong in the soldiers' ward, and still seeming to see fixed on him those envious looks which had followed him out from both sides, and the face of that young soldier with eyes rolled back. Denisov lay asleep on his bed with his head under the blanket, although it was nearly noon. "Ah, Rostov, how are you? How are you?" he called out, still in the same voice as in the regiment. But Rostov noticed sadly that under this habitual ease and animation some new, sinister, hidden feeling showed itself in the expression of Denisov's face and the intonations of his voice. His wound, though a slight one, had not yet healed even now, 6 weeks after he had been hit. His face had the same swollen pallor as the faces of the other hospital patients, but it was not that struck Rostov. What struck him was that Denisov did not seem glad to see him and smiled at him unnaturally. He did not ask about the regiment, nor about the general state of affairs, and when Rostov spoke of these matters did not listen. Rostov even noticed that Denisov did not like to be reminded of the regiment, or in general of that other free life which was going on outside the hospital. He seemed to try to forget that old life, and was only interested in the affair with the commissariat officers. On Rostov's inquiry as to how the matter stood, he at once produced from under his pillow a paper he had received from the commission and the rough draft of his answer to it. He became animated when he began reading his paper, and specially drew Rostov's attention to the stinging rejoinders he made to his enemies, his hospital companions, who had gathered round Rostov. A fresh arrival from the world outside gradually began to disperse as soon as Denisov began reading his answer. Rostov noticed by their faces that all those gentlemen had already heard that story more than once, and were tired of it. Only the man who had the next bed, a stout Uhlan, continued to sit on his bed, gloomily frowning and smoking a pipe, and little one-armed Túshin still listened, shaking his head disapprovingly. In the middle of the reading the Uhlan interrupted Denisov. "But what I say is," he said, turning to Rostov, "it would be best simply to petition the Emperor for pardon. They say great rewards will now be distributed, and surely a pardon would be granted." "Me petition the Emperor?" exclaimed Denisov in a voice to which he tried hard to give the old energy and fire, but which sounded like an expression of irritable impotence. "What for? If I were a wobber I would ask mercy, but I am being court-martialed for bringing wobbers to book. Let them try me. I'm not afraid of anyone. I've served the Czar and my country honorably and have not stolen. And am I to be degraded? Listen, I'm writing to them straight. This is what I say. If I had robbed the treasury—" "It's certainly well written," said Túshin, "but that's not the point, Vasíli Dmítrich." And he also turned to Rostov. "One has to submit, and Vasíli Dmítrich doesn't want to. You know the auditor told you it was a bad business." "Well, let it be bad," said Denisov. "The auditor wrote out a petition for you," continued Túshin, "and you ought to sign it and ask this gentleman to take it. No doubt he," indicating Rostov, "has connections on the staff. You won't find a better opportunity." "Haven't I said I'm not going to grovel?" Denisov interrupted him, went on reading his paper. Rostov had not the courage to persuade Denisov, though he instinctively felt that the way advised by Túshin and the other officers was the safest, and though he would have been glad to be of service to Denisov, He knew his stubborn will and straightforward, hasty temper. When the reading of Denisov's virulent reply, which took more than an hour, was over, Rostov said nothing, and he spent the rest of the day in a most dejected state of mind, amid Denisov's hospital comrades, who had round him, telling them what he knew and listening to their stories. Denisov was moodily silent all the evening. Late in the evening, when Rostov was about to leave, he asked Denisov whether he had no commission for him. "Yes, wait a bit," said Denisov, glancing round at the officers, and taking his papers from under his pillow, he went to the window, where he had an inkpot, and sat down to write. "It seems it's no use knocking one's head against a wall," he said, coming from the window and giving Rostov a large envelope. In it was the petition to the Emperor, drawn up by the auditor, in which Denisov, without alluding to the offences of the commissariat officials, simply asked for pardon. Handed in, it seems. He did not finish, but gave a painfully unnatural smile. End of chapter 18.
War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 19, read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Having returned to the regiment and told the commander the state of Denisov's affairs, Rostov wrote to Tilsit with the letter to the Emperor. On the 13th of June, the French and Russian Emperors arrived in Tilsit. Boris Drubetskoy had asked the important personage on whom he was in attendance to include him in the suite appointed for the stay at Tilsit. "I should like to see the great man," he said, alluding to Napoleon, whom hitherto he, like everyone else, had always called Bonaparte. "You are speaking of Bonaparte?" asked the general, smiling. Boris looked at his general inquiringly and immediately saw that he was being tested. "I am speaking, Prince, of the Emperor Napoleon," he replied. The general patted him on the shoulder with a smile. "You'll go far," he said, and took him to Tilsit with him. Boris was among the few present at the Niemen on the day the two emperors met. He saw the raft decorated with monograms, saw Napoleon pass before the French guards on the farther bank of the river, saw the pensive face of the Emperor Alexander as he sat in silence in a tavern on the bank of the Niemen awaiting Napoleon's arrival, saw both emperors get into boats, and saw how Napoleon, reaching the raft first, stepped quickly forward to meet Alexander and held out his hand to him, and how they both retired into the pavilion. Since he had begun to move in the highest circles, Boris had made it his habit to watch attentively all that went on around him and to note it down. At the time of the meeting at Tilsit, he asked the names of those who had come with Napoleon and about the uniforms they wore, and listened attentively to words spoken by important personages. At the moment the emperors went into the pavilion, he looked at his watch and did not forget to look at it again when Alexander came out. The interview had lasted an hour and 53 minutes. He noted this down that same evening, among other facts he felt to be of historic importance. As the Emperor's suite was a very small one, it was a matter of great importance for a man who valued his success in the service to be at Tilsit on the occasion of this interview between the two emperors, and having succeeded in this, Boris felt that henceforth his position was fully assured. He had not only become known, but people had grown accustomed to him and accepted him. Twice he had executed commissions to the Emperor himself, so that the latter knew his face, and all those at court far from cold-shouldering him, as at first when they considered him a newcomer, would now have been surprised had he been absent. Boris lodged with another adjutant, the Polish Count Zilinski. Zilinski, a Pole brought up in Paris, was rich and passionately fond of the French, and almost every day of the stay at Tilsit, French officers of the Guard and from French headquarters were dining and lunching with him and Boris. On the evening of the 24th of June, Count Zilinski arranged a supper for his French friends. The guest of honor was an aide-de-camp of Napoleon's. There were also several French officers of the Guard and a page of Napoleon's, a young lad of an old aristocratic French family. That same day Rostov, profiting by the darkness to avoid being recognized in civilian dress, came to Tilsit and went to the lodging occupied by Boris and Zilinski. Rostov, in common with the whole army from which he came, was far from having experienced a change of feeling toward Napoleon and the French, who, from being foes, had suddenly become friends, that had taken place at headquarters and in Boris. In the army, Bonaparte and the French were still regarded with mingled feelings of anger, contempt, and fear. Only recently, talking with one of Platov's Cossack officers, Rostov had argued that if Napoleon were taken prisoner, he would be treated not as a sovereign, but as a criminal. Quite lately, happening to meet a wounded French colonel on the road, Rostov had maintained with heat that peace was impossible between a legitimate sovereign and the criminal Bonaparte. Rostov was therefore unpleasantly struck by the presence of French officers in Boris's lodging, dressed in uniforms he had been accustomed to see from quite a different point of view, from the outposts of the flank. As soon as he noticed a French officer who thrust his head out of the door, that warlike feeling of hostility, which he always experienced at the sight of the enemy, suddenly seized him. He stopped at the threshold and asked in Russian whether Drubetskoi lived there. Boris, hearing a strange voice in the anteroom, came out to meet him. An expression of annoyance showed itself for a moment on his face on first recognizing Rostov. "Ah, it is you! Very glad to see you," he said, however, coming toward him with a smile. But Rostov had noticed his first impulse. "I have come at a bad time, I think. I should not have come, but I have business," he said coldly. "No, I only wonder how you managed to get away from your regiment." "Dans un moment je suis à vous." "In a minute I shall be at your disposal," he said, answering someone who called him. "I see I am intruding," Rostov repeated. The look of annoyance had already disappeared from Borís' face. Having evidently reflected and decided how to act, he very quietly took both Rostov's hands and led him into the next room. His eyes, looking serenely and steadily at Rostov, seemed to be veiled by something, as if screened by blue spectacles of conventionality. So it seemed to Rostov. "Oh, come now, as if you could come at the wrong time," said Borís, and he led him into the room where the supper table was laid and introduced him to his guests, explaining that he was not a civilian but a hussar officer and an old friend of his. "Count Zilinski, le Comte N.N., le Capitaine S.S.," said he, naming his guests. Rostov looked frowningly at the Frenchman, bowed reluctantly, and remained silent. Zhilinsky evidently did not receive this new Russian person very willingly into his circle, and did not speak to Rostov. Boris did not appear to notice the constraint the newcomer produced, and with the same pleasant composure and the same veiled look in his eyes with which he had met Rostov, tried to enliven the conversation. One of the Frenchmen, with the politeness characteristic of his countrymen, addressed the obstinately taciturn Rostov, saying that the latter had probably come to Tilsit to see the Emperor. "No, I came on business," replied Rostov briefly. Rostov had been out of humor from the moment he noticed the look of dissatisfaction on Borís' face, and as always happens to those in a bad humor, it seemed to him that everyone regarded him with aversion, and that he was in everybody's way. He really was in their way, for he alone took no part in the conversation, which again became general. The looks the visitors cast on him seemed to say, "And what is he sitting here for?" He rose and went up to Boris. "Anyhow, I am in your way," he said in a low tone. "Come and talk over my business, and I will go away." "Oh no, not at all," said Boris, "but if you are tired, come and lie down in my room and have a rest." "Yes, really." They went into the little room where Boris slept. Rostov, without sitting down, began at once, irritably, as if Boris were to blame in some way, telling him about Denisov's affair, asking him whether, through his general, he could and would intercede with the Emperor on Denisov's behalf and get Denisov's petition handed in. When he and Boris were alone, Rostov felt for the first time that he could not look Boris in the face without a sense of awkwardness. Boris, with one leg crossed over the other and stroking his left hand with the slender fingers of his right, listened to Rostov as a general listens to the report of a subordinate, now looking aside, now gazing straight into Rostov's eyes with the same veiled look. Each time this happened, Rostov felt uncomfortable and cast down his eyes. "I have heard of such cases and know that His Majesty is very severe in such affairs. I think it would be best not to bring it before the Emperor, but to apply to the commander of the corps. But in general, I think... So you don't want to do anything? Well then, say so," Rostov almost shouted, not looking Boris in the face. Boris smiled. "On the contrary, I will do what I can. Only I thought..." At that moment Zhilinsky's voice was heard calling Boris. "Well then, go, go, go," said Rostov, and refusing supper and remaining alone in the little room, he walked up and down for a long time, hearing the light-hearted French conversation from the next room. End of chapter 19. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. No. War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 20. Recording by Eva Harnick. Rostov had come to Tilsit the day least suitable for a petition on Denisov's behalf. He could not himself go to the general in attendance, as he was in mufti and had come to Tilsit without permission to do so, and Boris, even had he wished to, could not have done so on the following day. On that day, June 27, the preliminaries of peace were signed. The emperors exchanged decorations. Alexander received the Cross of the Legion of Honor, and Napoleon of the Order of St. Andrew of the First Degree, and a dinner had been arranged for the evening, given by a battalion of the French Guards to the Preobrazhensk battalion. The emperors were to be present at that banquet. Rostov felt so ill at ease and uncomfortable with Boris that when the latter looked in after supper he pretended to be asleep and early next morning went away, avoiding Boris. In his civilian clothes and the round hat he wandered about the town, staring at the French and their uniforms and at the streets and houses where the Russian and French emperors were staying. In a square he saw tables being set up and preparations made for the dinner. He saw the Russian and French colors draped from side to side on the streets, with huge monograms A and N. In the windows of the houses also flags and bunting were displayed. Boris doesn't want to help me, and I don't want to ask him. That is settled, thought Nicholas. All is over between us, but I won't leave here without having done all I can for Denisov, and certainly not without getting his letter to the Emperor. The Emperor! He is here, thought Rostov, who had unconsciously returned to the house where Alexander lodged. Saddled horses were standing before the house, and the suite were assembling, evidently preparing for the Emperor to come out. I may see him at any moment, thought Rostov. If only I were to hand the letter direct to him and tell him all. Could they really arrest me for my civilian clothes? Surely not. He would understand on whose side justice lies. He understands everything, knows everything. Who can be more just, more magnanimous than he? And even if they did arrest me for being here, what would it matter? Thought he, looking at an officer who was entering the house the Emperor occupied. After all, people do go in. It is all nonsense. I will go in and hand the letter to the Emperor myself, so much the worse for Drubetskoi, who drives me to it. And suddenly, with a determination he himself did not expect, Rostov felt for the letter in his pocket and went straight to the house. No, I won't miss my opportunity now, as I did after Austerlitz, he thought, expecting every moment to meet the monarch and conscious of the blood that rushed to his heart at the thought. I will fall at his feet and beseech him. He will lift me up, will listen, and will even thank me. I am happy when I can do good, but to remedy injustice is the greatest happiness. Rostov fancied the sovereign saying. And passing people who looked after him with curiosity, he entered the porch of the Emperor's house. A broad staircase led straight up from the entry, and to the right he saw a closed door. Below, under the staircase, was a door leading to the lower floor. "Whom do you want?" someone inquired. "To hand in a letter, a petition to His Majesty," said Nicholas with a tremor in his voice. "A petition? This way, to the officer on duty." He was shown the door leading downstairs. "Only it won't be accepted." On hearing this indifferent voice, Rostov grew frightened at what he was doing. The thought of meeting the Emperor at any moment was so fascinating and consequently so alarming that he was ready to run away, but the official who had questioned him opened the door and Rostov entered. A short, stout man of about 30, in white breeches and high boots and a batiste shirt that he had evidently only just put on, standing in that room, and his valet was buttoning on to the back of his breeches a new pair of handsome silk-embroidered braces that for some reason attracted Rostov's attention. This man was speaking to someone in the adjoining room. A good figure, and in her first bloom, he was saying, but on seeing Rostov he stopped short and frowned. "What is it? A petition?" "What is it?" asked the person in the other room. "Another petitioner," answered the man with the braces. "Tell him to come later." "He will be coming out directly. We must go." "Later, later, tomorrow. It is too late." Rostov turned and was about to go, but the man in the braces stopped him. "Whom have you come from? Who are you?" "I come from Major Denisov," answered Rostov. "Are you an officer?" "Lieutenant Count Rostov." "What audacity! Hand it in through your commander, and go along with you. Go!" And he continued to put on the uniform the valet handed him. Rostov went back into the hall and noticed that in the porch there were many officers and generals in full parade uniform whom he had to pass. Cursing his temerity, his heart sinking at the thought of finding himself at any moment face to face with the Emperor, and being put to shame and arrested in his presence, fully alive now to the impropriety of his conduct and repenting of it, Rostov, with downcast eyes, was making his way out of the house through the brilliant suite when a familiar voice called him and the hand detained him. "What are you doing here, sir, in civilian dress?" asked a deep voice. It was a cavalry general who had obtained the Emperor's special favor during this campaign and who had formerly commanded the division in which Rostov was serving. Rostov, in dismay, began justifying himself, but seeing the kindly jocular face of the general, he took him aside and in an excited voice told him the whole affair, asking him to intercede for Denisov, whom the general knew. Having heard Rostov to the end, the general shook his head gravely. "I am sorry, sorry for that fine fellow. Give me the letter." Hardly had Rostov handed him the letter and finished explaining Denisov's case when hasty steps and the jingling of spurs were heard on the stairs, and the general, leaving him, went to the porch. The gentlemen of the Emperor's suite ran down the stairs and went to their horses. Hain, the same groom who had been at Austerlitz, led up the Emperor's horse, and the faint creak of a footstep new at once was heard on the stairs. Forgetting the danger of being recognized, Rostov went close to the porch, together with some inquisitive civilians, and again, after 2 years, saw those features he adored, that same face and same look and step, and the same union of majesty and mildness. And the feeling of enthusiasm and love for his sovereign rose again in Rostov's soul in all its old force. In the uniform of the Preobrazhensk regiment, white chamois leather breeches and high boots, and wearing a star Rostov did not know, it was that of the Legion d'Honneur, the monarch came out into the porch, putting on his gloves and carrying his hat under his arm. He stopped and looked about him, brightening everything around by his glance. He spoke a few words to some of the generals, and recognizing the former commander of Rostov's division, smiled and beckoned to him. All the suite drew back, and Rostov saw the general talking for some time to the Emperor. The Emperor said a few words to him and took a step toward his horse. Again the crowd of members of the suite and street gazers, among whom was Rostov, moved nearer to the Emperor. Stopping beside his horse, with his hand on the saddle, the Emperor turned to the cavalry general and said in a loud voice, evidently wishing to be heard by all: "I cannot do it, General, I cannot, because the law is stronger than I," and he raised his foot to the stirrup. The general bowed his head respectfully, and the monarch mounted and rode down the street at a gallop. Beside himself with enthusiasm, Rostov ran after him with the crowd. End of chapter 20. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 21. Read for LibriVox.org by Robbie Rogers. The Emperor rode to the square where, facing one another, a battalion of the Preobrazhensk regiment stood on the right, and a battalion of the French Guards in their bearskin caps on the left. As the Tsar rode up to one flank of the battalions, which presented arms, another group of horsemen galloped up to the opposite flank, and at the head of them Rostov recognized Napoleon. It could be no one else. He came at a gallop, wearing a small hat, a blue uniform over a white vest, and the St. Andrew ribbon over his shoulder. He was riding a very fine thoroughbred gray Arab horse with a crimson gold-embroidered saddle-cloth. On approaching Alexander, he raised his hat, and as he did so, Rostov, with his cavalryman's eye, could not help noticing that Napoleon did not sit well or firmly in the saddle. The battalion shouted "Hurrah!" and "Vive l'Empereur!" Napoleon said something to Alexander, and both emperors dismounted and took each other's hands. Napoleon's face wore an unpleasant and artificial smile. Alexander was saying something affable to him. In spite of the trampling of the French gendarmes' horses, which were pushing back the crowd, Rostov kept his eye on every movement of Alexander and Bonaparte. It struck him as a surprise that Alexander treated Bonaparte as an equal, and that the latter was quite at ease with the Tsar, as if such relations with an emperor were an everyday matter to him. Alexander and Napoleon, with a long train of their suites, approached the right flank of the Preobrazhensk battalion and came straight up to the crowd standing there. The crowd unexpectedly found itself so close to the emperors that Rostov, standing in the front row, was afraid he might be recognized. "Sire, I ask your permission to present the Legion of Honor to the bravest of your soldiers," said a sharp, precise voice, articulating every letter. This was said by the undersized Napoleon, looking up straight into Alexander's eyes. Alexander listened attentively to what was said to him and, bending his head, smiled pleasantly. "To him who has borne himself most bravely in this last war," added Napoleon, accentuating every syllable, as with a composure and assurance exasperating to Rostov, he ran his eyes over the Russian ranks drawn up before him, who all presented arms with their eyes fixed on their emperor. "Will your Majesty allow me to consult the colonel?" said Alexander, and took a few hasty steps towards Prince Kozlóvski, the commander of the battalion. Bonaparte meanwhile began taking the glove off his small white hand, tore it in doing so, and threw it away. An aide-de-camp behind him rushed forward and picked it up. "To whom shall it be given?" the Emperor Alexander asked Kozlóvski in Russian in a low voice. "To whomever your Majesty commands." The Emperor knit his brows with dissatisfaction and, glancing back, remarked, "But we must give him an answer." Kozlóvski scanned the ranks resolutely and included Rostov in his scrutiny. "Can it be me?" thought Rostov. "Lázarev!" the colonel called, with a frown, and Lázarev, the first soldier in the rank, stepped briskly forward. "Where are you off to? Stop here!" voices whispered to Lázarev, who did not know where to go. Lázarev stopped, casting a sidelong look at his colonel in alarm. His face twitched, as often happens to soldiers called before the ranks. Napoleon slightly turned his head and put his plump little hand out behind him as if to take something. The members of his suite, guessing at once what he wanted, moved about and whispered as they passed something from one to another, and a page, the same one Rostov had seen the previous evening at Boris's, ran forward and, bowing respectfully over the outstretched hand, and not keeping it waiting a moment, laid in it an order on a red ribbon. Napoleon, without looking, pressed two fingers together, and the badge was between them. Then he approached Lázarev, who rolled his eyes and persistently gazed at his own monarch, looked round at Emperor Alexander to imply that what he was doing was done for the sake of his ally, and the small white hand holding the order touched one of Lázarev's buttons. It was as if Napoleon knew that it was only necessary for his hand to deign to touch that soldier's breast for the soldier to be forever happy, rewarded, and distinguished from everyone else in the world. Napoleon merely laid the cross on Lázarev's breast, and dropping his hand, turned toward Alexander as though sure that the cross would adhere there. And it really did. Officious hands, Russian and French, immediately seized the cross and fastened it to the uniform. Lázarev glanced morosely at the little man with the white hands, who was doing something to him, and still standing motionless, presenting arms, looked again straight into Alexander's eyes, as if asking whether he should stand there, or go away, or do something else. But receiving no orders, he remained for some time in that rigid position. The emperors remounted and rode away. The Preobrazhénsk battalion, breaking rank, mingled with the French guards and sat down at the tables prepared for them. Lázarev sat in a place of honor. Russian and French officers embraced him, congratulated him, and pressed his hands. Crowds of officers and civilians drew near merely to see him. A rumble of French and Russian voices and laughter filled the air around the tables in the square. Two officers with flushed faces, looking cheerful and happy, passed by Rostov. "What do you think of the treat, all on silver plate?" one of them was saying. "Have you seen Lázarev?" "I have." "Tomorrow, I hear, the Preobrazhénskis will give them a dinner." "Yes, but what luck for Lázarev! 1,200 francs pension for life." "Here's a cap, lads!" shouted a Preobrazhénsk soldier, donning a shaggy French cap. "It's a fine thing, first rate." "Have you heard the password?" asked one guards officer of another. "The day before yesterday it was Napoleon, France, bravoure. Yesterday, Alexander, Russie, grandeur. One day our Emperor gives it and the next day Napoleon. Tomorrow our Emperor will send a St. George's Cross to the bravest of the French guards. It has to be done. He must respond in kind." Boris, too, with his friend Zhilinsky, came to see the Preobrazhénsk banquet. On his way back he noticed Rostov standing by the corner of a house. "Rostov, how do you do? We missed one another," he said, and could not refrain from asking what was the matter, so strangely dismal and troubled was Rostov's face. "Nothing, nothing," replied Rostov. "You'll call round?" "Yes, I will." Rostov stood at that corner for a long time, watching the feast from a distance. In his mind a painful process was going on which he could not bring to a conclusion. Terrible doubts rose in his soul. Now he remembered Denisov with his changed expression, his submission, and the whole hospital with arms and legs torn off in its dirt and disease. So vividly did he recall the hospital stench of dead flesh that he looked round to see where the smell came from. Next he thought of that self-satisfied Bonaparte with his small white hand, who was now an emperor, liked and respected by Alexander. Then why those severed arms and legs and those dead men? Then again he thought of Lázarev rewarded and Denisov punished and unpardoned. He caught himself harboring such strange thoughts that he was frightened. The smell of the food of the Preobrazhénskis were eating and a sense of hunger recalled him from those reflections. He had to get something to eat before going away. He went to a hotel he had noticed that morning. There he found so many people, among them officers who, like himself, had come in civilian clothes, that he had difficulty in getting a dinner. Two officers of his own division joined him. The conversation naturally turned on the peace. The officers, his comrades, like most of the army, were dissatisfied with the peace concluded after the Battle of Friedland. They said that had we held out a little longer Napoleon would have been done for, as his troops had neither provisions nor ammunition. Nicholas ate and drank, chiefly the latter, in silence. He finished a couple of bottles of wine by himself. The process in his mind went on tormenting him without reaching a conclusion. He feared to give way to his thoughts, yet could not get rid of them. Suddenly, on one of the officers saying that it was humiliating to look at the French, Rostov began shouting with uncalled for wrath, and therefore much to the surprise of the officers. "How can you judge what's best?" he cried, the blood suddenly rushing to his face. "How can you judge the Emperor's actions? What right have we to argue? We cannot comprehend either the Emperor's aims or his actions." "But I never said a word about the Emperor," said the officer, justifying himself, and unable to understand Rostov's outburst, except on the supposition that he was drunk. But Rostov did not listen to him. "We're not diplomatic officers, we're soldiers and nothing more," he went on. "If we're ordered to die, we must die. If we're punished, it means that we have deserved it. It's not for us to judge. If the Emperor pleases to recognize Bonaparte as Emperor and to conclude an alliance with him, it means that it is the right thing to do. If once we begin judging and arguing about everything, nothing sacred will be left. That way we shall be saying there is no God, nothing," shouted Nicholas, banging the table. Very little to the point as it seemed to his listeners, but quite relevantly to the courses of his own thoughts. "Our business is to do our duty, to fight and not to think, that's all," he said. "And to drink," said one of the officers, not wishing to quarrel. "Yes, and to drink," assented Nicholas. "Hullo there, another bottle!" he shouted. In 1808 the Emperor Alexander went to Erfurt for a fresh interview with the Emperor Napoleon, and in the upper circles of Petersburg there was much talk of the grandeur of this important meeting. End of chapter 21.
War and Peace, Book 5, Chapter 22, read for LibriVox.org by Rainer. In 1809, the intimacy between the world's two arbiters, as Napoleon and Alexander were called, was such that when Napoleon declared war on Austria, a Russian corps crossed the frontier to cooperate with our old enemy Bonaparte against our old ally the Emperor of Austria, and in court circles the possibility of marriage between Napoleon and one of Alexander's sisters was spoken of. But besides considerations of foreign policy, the attention of Russian society was at that time keenly directed on the internal changes that were being undertaken in all the departments of government. Life, meanwhile, real life, with its essential interests of health and sickness, toil and rest, and its intellectual interests in thought, science, poetry, music, love, friendship, hatred and passions, went on as usual, independently of and apart from political friendship or enmity with Napoleon Bonaparte and from all the schemes of reconstruction. End of chapter 22. End of War and Peace, Book 5 by Leo Tolstoy.